Welcome to section 3 of the Learn R programming video series. This section is on working with base R data structures. In this section, we'll return to vectors and learn about them in greater depth. We'll learn about matrices and arrays, about lists, about data frames, and about factors. This video is on exploring vectors in depth and understanding data types. In this video, we'll examine the character and logical data types. We'll learn how to perform vector subsetting, and we'll learn about vector names. Let's move back into RStudio. So in previous videos, we've created vectors that contain numbers. So for example, a vector of the numbers from 1 to 10, or using the C function, we can create a vector from a list of numbers. But numbers aren't the only type of data that a vector can contain. The type of data that a vector can contain is called that vector's data type. And in this video, we're going to learn about two new data types. The first new data type that we'll learn about is called the character data type. The character data type is for vectors that contain text, and that text could be as simple as a single letter or a single numeral. It could be a word, or even a sentence or a paragraph. So let's see an example. Using the C function again, we're going to create a vector of the character data type. Each element of the vector is surrounded by quotation marks to indicate that that element is a piece of text. So we'll create a vector containing the words apple, banana, and cherry. And R returns the elements surrounded by quotation marks, so we can see that this is a vector of length 3. It contains 3 elements. The first element is the word apple, the second is the word banana, and the third is the word cherry. And as with other vectors we've created before, we can assign this vector to a variable. Let's call it fruits. So here's the fruits vector with its 3 elements. R provides a function called typeof, that's typeof, and the typeof function will return the data type of a vector. So if we run the typeof function on the fruits vector, R tells us, as we expected, this vector is of the data type character. It's a character vector. Let's see what happens if we run the typeof function on the vector of the integers from 1 to 10. R tells us that the data type of this vector is called integer. What happens if we run the typeof function on a list of numbers, including some numbers with decimal points? This time, the typeof function returns a different data type. It tells us that the type of this vector is double. There are actually 3 different data types for holding numbers. The integer data type for holding integers, the double data type, which is for holding numbers with decimal points, and a third type called complex, which is for holding complex numbers, such as the square root of -1. For the purposes of this video, and for most of the R code that you'll write, the difference between these data types doesn't really matter, and those 3 different data types can collectively be referred to as the numeric data types. We'll just call them numeric from now on. Any data type that contains numbers will simply be called numeric. And R even provides a function called is.numeric that will return true for both the integer and the double data types. So we've learned about one new data type, the character data type. Let's learn about a second new data type. This one's called logical. The logical data type can only contain 2 different values, either true or false. Let's see an example. So again, using the C function. So we have a list of 4 values, and each of the values is either true or false. So it's a vector of length 4 values, true, false, false, true. Instead of using the full words true or false, we can use a capital T or capital F as an abbreviation, and R will still understand that we mean the words true or false. So now you know how to create vectors of the numeric type, of the character type, and of the logical type. Another important skill when working with vectors is called vector subsetting. Vector subsetting refers to selecting particular elements within a vector. There are 2 different ways to subset vectors, and we'll learn about both of them in this video. The first way is based on the position of the elements that you wish to subset or select within the vector. So let's create a vector. We're going to call it basket, and it will contain 3 numbers, the number 3, the number 5, and the number 9. So here's our basket vector, 3 elements, the number 3, the number 5, and the number 9. Let's suppose we wanted to select the first element within this vector, the number 3. We type the name of the vector, basket, followed by square brackets, opening and closing. There's no space between the name of the vector and the square brackets. Inside the square brackets, we type the number corresponding to the position of the element within the vector we wish to subset or select. So to select the first element of the vector, the number 3, we type 1 in the square brackets. I press enter, and R returns the first element of the vector, the number 3. Similarly, I can select the second element of the vector, the number 5, or the third element of the vector, the number 9. Subsetting a vector doesn't mean you can only select one element at once. You can select more than one. So for example, I could select the first and third elements of the vector, the numbers 3 and 9. Using the colon operator, I could select the second and third elements, or even all 3 elements. And I can even select the same element more than once. The first element, the second element, and then the first element again. As well as using positive numbers to select elements of a vector, you can use negative numbers to drop or remove elements. By typing a -1, I tell R that I want to drop or remove the first element of the vector. So R returns only the second and third elements, the numbers 5 and 9. Once again, I can use a list of negative numbers to drop more than one element. However, what I can't do is use a combination of negative and positive numbers. You can only use all negative or all positive numbers when subsetting a vector. So that's the first way to subset a vector, using numbers referring to the elements within a vector. The second way to subset a vector is to specify the names of the elements within a vector. So far we haven't learned about vector names, so let's have a look at naming vectors now. So once again, we're going to use the basket vector, and we'll create it again with the C function. But this time I'm going to use a slightly different approach when I list the elements of the vector within the C function. So the first element is going to say milk equals 3. The second element will say bread equals 5. And the third element will say rice equals 9. This time, if I type the name of the vector and R prints out the contents of the vector, we see that unlike previously, this time when R prints out the contents of the vector, it doesn't precede them by a 1 in square brackets. Instead, over each element of the vector, it puts the name of that element. So what we've done, using the C function, is given each element of the vector a name. The first element is named milk, the second element is named bread, the third element is named rice. It's important to recognize that the value of these elements hasn't changed. The value of the first element is still 3, the value of the second element is still 5, and the value of the third element is still 9. And we can verify this if we think back to the earlier videos when we learned about vector arithmetic. We learned that we can, for example, multiply every element in a vector by a certain number. So for example, if we say 2 times basket, and R returns 6, 10, and 18. So it's multiplied first element by 2, 3 times 2 is 6, the second element by 2, 5 times 2 is 10, and the third element times 2, 9 times 2 is 18. So naming the elements of the vector hasn't actually changed their value, they've just been given a name. By naming the elements of the vector, we can then refer to them by name when subsetting. So for example, again using square brackets for subsetting, I can refer to the first element, milk, or the second element, bread, or the third element, rice. And once again, using the C function to create a list, you can select more than one element, you can even select the same element twice, or select a single element, or subset a single element. In addition to naming vector elements when you create the vector using the C function, R also provides a function called names that allows you to name or rename the elements in a vector. Let's have a look at an example. We'll create a new vector, we'll call it plains, and we'll give it the values 4, 5, and 10. So here's the plains vector. If we use the names function on the plains vector, we get the value null because the elements in this vector don't have any names. However, we can assign some names to the vector by assigning values to the names function. So let's assign the values Cessna, Boeing, and Airbus. And now if we look at the plains vector, we see that the 3 elements have been named Cessna, Boeing, and Airbus. And again, if we use the names function, it returns the 3 names of the 3 elements in the vector, Cessna, Boeing, and Airbus. There's one final use for vector subsetting that we haven't looked at yet. So we've seen that we can use vector subsetting to access the elements of a vector, or the values of those elements. So we can get the value of the Cessna element with the name Cessna, or we can get the value of the second element in the vector with the number 2. But in addition to accessing the values of a vector using subsetting, you can also assign new values. So we can reassign to the second element in the vector the value, let's say, 11. Now if we look at the plains vector, the second element in the vector, the value named Boeing, has been given the new value of 11. And we can do the same thing using subsetting by name. So we can refer to the element in the vector named Airbus, and give it the value, let's say, 22. And now if we look at the values of the vector, the value for the element named Airbus has been changed to 22. Let's have a look at some exercises that will test your understanding of vector subsetting and naming. Exercise 1. Create a vector named months such that the name of a month can be accessed by its number. So for example, if you typed months 11, R should return the value November. Exercise 2. Create a vector named reverse months such that the number of a month can be accessed by its name. For example, if you type reverse months, March, R should return the number 3. Exercise 3. Find an R function that converts a character vector into all uppercase. Use it to convert the names of reverse months into all uppercase. And as a hint, if you're having trouble finding a function that performs this task, a Google search is usually a good way to find a function.